Egyptian civilization, the gift of the Nile. The objectives are 1. Specify why the Nile was crucial to the development of Egyptian civilization. And 2, identify the 3 major periods of Egyptian history. Now, first, again, we must focus on geography first. You're going to see a parallel, in some sense, to what we saw in Mesopotamia, but what we'll see also is a complete contrast. First, both civilizations really settled along rivers. These are river-valley civilizations. But the parallel largely ends there in terms of geography. The Nile is the longest river in the world, more than 4,000 miles. And the Nile Delta is called Lower Egypt. So the delta at the top of this picture is Lower Egypt. And the south, down to the bottom of this picture, is Upper Egypt. Don't get confused by that, because this has to do with geography, right? That the high hills are in the south, and they're causing the water flow to go down to the Mediterranean in the north, which is lower elevation, and so Upper and Lower Egypt. But here we're going to see these people really develop and thrive, particularly in the Delta area. So Egypt is important and has various important cities that really develop along the Delta. But really the miracle of the Nile is that the river rose in the summer from heavy rains in Central Africa, up down in that Upper Egypt, and reaching its zenith in somewhere around September and October, the waters flooded all along the Nile. And the Nile then deposited a rich, dark soil every single year. You could set your clock to it. In fact, the Egyptians did. They set their calendar to it. So it was regular, it was dependable. You knew for sure that it would happen, which is completely contrary to what we see in Mesopotamia, because it was irregular. You weren't sure when something like that would occur, which reflected into their deities and the way that they saw life around them. And equally so, this is what we're going to see in Egypt. That the black land, as they'll call it, that is the soil, the rich, dark soil, will be counterposed to the red land, that is that red, dry sand that exists everywhere else in Egypt. And so really we see a strange kind of two geographies in some sense. Everyone is settling along this river because it's very rich and dependable. But, of course, you can't ignore the fact that you have dark and dead deserts all around, that life really would be hard to survive. So here's kind of a close-up of a satellite image, so you could see the kind of rich areas that people were settling upon. Now, the Nile was the fastest way to travel through the land, making transportation and communication easier. People could build small skiffs or crafts, some kind of boat or some kind of method, and they would travel up the river or down the river, depending on what they were capable of doing. And getting down and bartering and communication, loading up some kind of skiff with trade and going down to be able to trade and barter is fundamental to this civilization. And so you're going to see a blossoming of that mode of transportation. And really what's really important and what allows for Egyptian civilization to blossom for so long is that Egypt had natural barriers. Egypt was surrounded by protective elements geographically that enabled it to thrive without external invasion, at least initially. So obviously you have the desert to the west. You have ocean or sea to the north and to the east, and you have mountains to the south. And so largely it's isolated. at least for an ancient context. There are other regions of the world that are more isolated and more protected, no question. But here, the counterpoint is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is in the middle of nowhere. It's wide and open, and so anyone really can invade it. Egypt proves to be a little more difficult. That, coupled with the regularity of the flooding of the Nile, created really a sense of security and changelessness in Egypt, that it always would maintain itself and would always be the same. And this is really how Egyptians began to conceive of their gods, too. Not as deities that fly off the handle, like the Sumerian Mesopotamian kind of concepts of deity, but eternal and changeless deities. And of course, this will affect, the entire civilization, because religion was really inseparable from normal life. And everything, every structure, every element was touched by it. And so, naturally, when they see the world around them and the dominance of something like, say, the sun, people would worship it. They would worship it as a source of life. And the deities around them that were established were important beings for their sustainability. Now, what's interesting is you begin to see in Egypt and Egyptian religion the blossoming of the idea of the afterlife. And you could see this in the deities Osiris, Isis, and Set. Now, Osiris and Isis are kind of the main kind of deities here, and they're also a husband and wife kind of duo here. And Set is the jealous brother that's left out of their love. And what happens is that Set is really angry at his brother Osiris, and so he ends up killing him and chopping him up to tiny bits and scattering him into the Nile. Now, Isis calls the animals and calls the creatures and has all the pieces of her husband brought back to her and pieced together. Now, while there's more to the narrative, the idea here of resurrection, of coming back from the dead, is an important theme. And Isis, the deity, has the ability to do this. And so there becomes this kind of undertone, whether for the wealthy elite or for the low class later. You have the emergence of this idea of afterlife in a tangible sense. Now, there may be seeds of the concept of afterlife in other religions, but you see this as a real articulation in their formalized religion. Now, over time, we see that the various kingdoms or city-states that kind of existed and they began to commingle together and conflict with each other until we see the rise of a real major empire or kingdom over Egypt. So the modern division of Egyptian history falls into three categories. Now, these are somewhat artificial. Historians use these categories. We have the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. And so between each period of stability, between each category of time, you have political chaos, you have invasions, you have things like that. But really the history of Egypt begins somewhere around 3100 BCE when we see Menes unite Upper and Lower Egypt, Upper and Lower Kingdoms, to form one unified Egypt along the Nile. And that's really what this carving really illustrates. The man looming over him is Menes, and he is about to bash him in the skull. And the concept here is that he is authoritative. You have the deity up in the right-hand corner showing the god's support. He is larger than anyone else in the picture, which shows that his kind of manhood, his awesomeness, his power. And he's about to bash that other king in the head, a warning perhaps to others that might see this. So Menes really unites the kingdoms and forms a dynasty, that is, a family of rulers whose right to rule is passed on within the family. And this really leads to the concept of kingship in Egypt as we'll see it. The kind of classic images that we see in the Old Kingdom from 2700 to 2200 BCE. That 500 window really creates kind of the classic images that we've seen in Egyptian civilization. Really, so the Egyptian monarchs become known as pharaoh, that is great house, or literally palace. And that is how they convey themselves. Kingship was a divine institution, and the pharaoh possessed absolute power. Now, this will, of course, in some sense, parallel to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the kings received authority from the divine. However, we're going to see a slight shift in this concept emerge over time in Egyptian civilization. So keep an eye out for it when we see it. But we're going to see that during the Old Kingdom, a government of bureaucracy really emerges. Now, bureaucracy is an administrative organization with officials and regular procedures. So the kingdom is divided up into departments or bureaus, I guess. And these bureaus then are governed by certain leaders that the pharaoh will give authority to. Now, in this early stage, really the person who has the most political authority next to the pharaoh is the vizier. He's really the right-hand man to the pharaoh, and he really is a steward of the land, and ran the government and the government bureaucracy and the everyday kind of monotony. The pharaoh didn't do that. The pharaoh focused on his monarchical authority and his authority given to him by the deities. But really, there's some element that began to crop up in the idea that he was a deity himself. And this connects, of course, to their monumental architecture and what's most famous for their development and worship of these pharaohs / gods, and that would be the pyramids. So the building of the pyramids is, in the Old Kingdom, served as kind of burial sites for pharaohs and their families and servants. But this, of course, is connected to a transitory method by which they can get to the afterlife. So inside the pyramids, they stocked them with supplies, chairs, boats, chests full of treasure, weapons, food. Of course, all of these things were needed for when the pharaoh's spiritual body, his ka, returns to his physical body. So his spiritual kind of soul, or ka, reincorporates itself into his physical body. And this was important, that the body would be preserved, because that's his body. And so the best way to preserve his physical body, the Egyptians devised a method called mummification, in which they removed all of the soft tissue of the body and placed them in jars for incorporation later. So you see the removal of the brain and the heart and the organs, and really dry out the body so that it would be preserved. And so, of course, if you go to any major museum, you're going to see mummies on display all over the place, particularly the British Museum. And so the concept was that the mummy would be revitalized and then continue on his life. Now, the largest and most kind of magnificent and impressive pyramid was built by King Khufu in Giza. Obviously, this is well known for the Sphinx, right? So the here at Giza, you have that huge statue kind of looming or guarding the pharaoh. And so these really served as important symbols of royal power. I mean, if you could imagine, if you were an ancient Egyptian, and you saw these huge buildings and huge statues, you would be intimidated. You would be awestruck. I mean, even today we're awestruck by them when we go and see them. And they're incredibly impressive. But imagine someone who hadn't seen anything large in their entire life. And we see large buildings all the time. You go to LA, you see huge skyscrapers. Now, you might be in awe of their craftsmanship, but it seems to be just kind of a normal thing we see. But here you see not only incredible beauty and elegance in some of the carvings, but the massiveness of them that really just are meant to symbolically show the authority that the pharaohs have over you, over this civilization. Now, after a collapse of that old kingdom, you have a period of stability emerge, really around 2050 to 1652, and this is the Middle Kingdom, really the classic period for Egyptian civilization. Now, Egypt began a period of expansion. They conquered Nubia to the south. They conquered Palestine. They conquered Syria, moving up along that eastern Mediterranean seaboard. You see major trade emerge between Kush, Syria, Mesopotamia, Crete. So you see Egypt really blossoming and really expanding in its power. And really, in the Old Kingdom, Pharaoh was seen as a god king, one who would be really transitioned into the afterlife, and that still existed in this period. But really, Pharaoh became, in the middle period, more equated to a shepherd, one who cares for his people and provided public works. And so Pharaoh, being the good shepherd, guides his sheep in the future to prosperity. And obviously these kind of religious images will inevitably kind of crop into other religions that we'll become more familiar with. But the Middle Kingdom came to an end in somewhere around 1652 BCE with the invasion of the Hyksos. Now, not much is known of the Hyksos. They used horse-drawn war chariots, and they dominated Egyptian soldiers. Now, the Hyksos, being that they used horse-drawn chariots, they used bronze, really dominated this kind of quasi-Stone Age people in Egypt. And the Hyksos seemed to be some kind of Indo-European civilization. And during this same time, all over the Mediterranean and the Middle East, you see a people group that really dominate and collapse the old order that existed before. But from the Hyksos and from this invasion, the Egyptians learned the use of bronze. They learned the use of bronze for tools and for weapons and for art. They also, of course, got the war chariot from the Hyksos. So the famous images you've seen in popular media or in film or something, the Egyptians were not the ones to invent the war chariot. The Indo-Europeans were. And so here the war chariot then will be incorporated into the Egyptian military machine. So this new dynasty that emerges, as we'll see, in the wake of the Hyksos, used these weapons to reunite Egypt and really expand their empire. And this last empire lasted a great deal of time, from 1567 to 1085. And so this new kingdom that emerges will be more powerful and able to keep up with the other kingdoms emerging. Now, obviously this is a long period of time, so let's just speak generally. Some of the main kind of figures that crop up, first is Hatshepsut. She is the first woman to become pharaoh. She built a great temple at Deir el-Bahari, and she was, of course, not well received because she's female. This is largely a patriarchal society. And so while she maintained her position, she had to kind of convey in an artistic sense the same sort of things that males had to, which was the stylized kind of beard that the pharaoh wore, though not a true beard, but the kind of braided beard that went down from the chin in the artistic form. I mean, the pharaoh had to maintain this, and so she wasn't well liked, but got stuff done and was well remembered. But perhaps one of the most important figures is Amenhotep IV, which really introduces some of the major shifts that are going on in this civilization and wider civilization. Amenhotep IV introduced the worship of a new and monotheistic god named Aton. This is seriously one of the first times that we see monotheism crop up in certain regions. Now, it may not be true monotheism. It may be a form of monolatry, which is actually that there are many gods, but we have one God ourselves, right? That is monolatry versus monotheism. But in any case, Amenhotep wants to shift the worship of the state, not just him as a person, right? There is no individuality of religion in this ancient world. Really, individual religious expression is a modern notion. Amenhotep IV wants to shift the nation, the kingdom's worship of the various old Egyptian gods away from them to Aton. And he changes his name to Kenaton and closes the old temples. And so you could see that pharaohs incorporate the deities they worship into their names. So Menhotep, Amun is so you have these kind of ancient deities that kind of reside within your names. But Akhenaton really wanted to shift this. Now, whether it was out of true religious belief is unclear. He certainly wanted to break the political power of the priests that had a great deal of authority in his culture. So maybe he was trying to rob the priests of their political authority to solidify power in his own hands, possibly. But we see a major shift in art at the time, too. Akhenaton chose to have himself depicted in a more realistic sense rather than the deified, idealized kind of images. So you can see this in the sculpture on the right, which is a completely different Egyptian approach. You could see variation and not necessarily the kind of classic authoritative, strong jawline that you see in other Egyptian art forms. So he's choosing to depict himself in a real light, not as a deity, which is interesting. He's shifting himself away from the concept of being a deity himself and more toward the worship of one deity. Well, whatever the case might be, after his death, his son ends up shifting his name back to the old deities' names. So his son, Tutankhamun, is his name that he shifts back to the old deities. Now, he was relatively young, of course. I mean, he was under 8 years old when he took power, so it was likely that he was influenced strongly by the other political leaders and the priests. And so he restores the old gods, opens the temples, and restores that old traditional religious narrative and religious tradition. What's interesting, though, is that Tutankhamun is killed at 8 years old, just around that age. When his tomb was found in the 20s, it was a huge uproar in terms of the American Western response to it because of its wealth and pomp, and it had never been opened in antiquity. But what's important here is that through recent study, they were able to scan his body, his mummy, and see the huge crack in the back of his head. Was this some sort of assassination? It's unclear. But the tumultuous time of the New Kingdom was problematic. So you see religious revolution really weakened the Egyptian empire. There's a religious tumultuous time going on right around this period. Now, under Ramses II, who is here depicted on the right, the Egyptians expanded once again aggressively, expanding their kingdom to new regions. But they were invaded by a mysterious group that we are really unclear of. They're referred to by the Egyptians as the Sea Peoples. They came from the sea and attacked Egypt at this time and ended really the Egyptian empire. They ended the New Kingdom. And this is really the end of the formal kind of classic Egyptian empire, Egyptian kingdom. And so Egypt transitioned into a kingdom that was dominated by other kingdoms. So eventually the Libyans, then the Nubians, then the Persians, then the Macedonians, eventually the Romans. All these people conquered Egypt during the next 1,000+ years and really dominated the region. But still, ancient Egypt loomed in the psyche of the peoples around them and really was a symbol of the ancient way. Now, let's talk about some of the features of the Egyptian civilization. Society in Egypt, for example. Egyptian society maintained a simple structure with Pharaoh at the peak, with the rest supporting him. Pharaoh is the ultimate authority. You see agriculture, heavy trade. Egyptian artisans really dominate the economy. You have stone dishes, papyrus paper, linen cloth. These are huge developments. Papyrus is one of the most important developments, I would argue, because instead of the Sumerian method of clay tablet impression through cuneiform, you end up having papyrus, a reed paper, really devised and invented by the Egyptians that could be written on, which we still have many of these fragments today that are discovered. Now, of course, most of the low-class people were really peasant farmers. And again, we see this same kind of pattern in Sumeria as well. The artisans and ruling authority, priesthood, they're all at the top of this society. But the bulk of the Egyptian civilization was agricultural-based, farming. Now, daily life in ancient Egypt looked similar to what we've seen in Sumeria, with slight variations. Monogamy was really the general rule, though polygamy did occur. That is, that most men had one wife, and that was generally how it was. However, some rich people had multiple wives. Pharaoh, for example, might have women on the side. Wealthy people would certainly have this as the case. But what was different here is that women's property and inheritance stayed in the hands of women. This isn't as aggressively patriarchal as we'll see in other places. Women still had their connection to inheritance, that whereas other places will say that women cannot inherit property. Parents, of course, arranged marriages for their children. This is a typical ancient practice. The chief purpose, of course, through marriage was to have children, to carry on the family line. And so it was expected that you would have children immediately. Most marriages began for the women at age 12 to 14. This was a common age for women in Egyptian civilization to marry. Why? Because they were considered women and ready to be married. Because, why? They had become a woman by somewhere around that time. By definition in their ancient culture, the moment that a woman reached puberty and was capable of having children, she should be married and should begin to produce children really during those fertile early years. You also have to remember that in ancient civilization, this is an ancient civilization, there is no modern medicine, and so, of course, lifespans can be relatively short. Women could easily die in childbirth, much more commonly in the ancient context than in the modern. Now, writing, of course, is really important in Egyptian civilization as it was in Mesopotamian as well. Really around 3000 BCE, right around the same time that the Mesopotamians devised their writing system, we see the Egyptians devise hieroglyphs. That is, literally means priest carvings or sacred carvings. Glyphs, meaning writing, and hiero, meaning sacred or priestly. And really, again, this is a symbolic sort of system, like cuneiform, images that convey concepts. Over time, you end up seeing hieratic script emerge, which was simplified, though still connected to symbols. It was simplified for the use of economic trade, business, things like that. Of these were carved into stone and papyrus, written on papyrus, and this is how we end up seeing and preserving these sort of writing systems. We also see in ancient Egyptian civilization the advancement of art and sciences in general. Obviously, they're going to have a strong knowledge of the body. The human body was often portrayed as a combination of profile and semi-profile, and frontal view to accurately represent each part of the person. Usually very standardized in terms of ignoring any sort of imperfection and really conveying the best imaginable kind of image. The Egyptians developed an accurate calendar, somewhere around 365-day calendar based on the year, not only on the movement of the moon, but also on the brightest star, Sirius. And so they get a quite advanced astronomical science developed, which will be true of the Babylonians as well. But really, the practice of embalming and forming a mummy really led to medical expertise in human anatomy, which will lead to medical breakthrough for many of the Egyptians into the practices of surgery and things like that. So our objectives were, 1, specify why the Nile was crucial to the development of Egyptian civilization, and 2nd, identify the 3 major periods of Egyptian history.